each other.
No, even in the ancient world, divine revelation comes into a primitive, barbaric world, which is full of a lot of really bad guys.
And God says, keep going.
No,
Keep it up. You're doing such a good job.
God does not say keep going.
The God that you believe in is acting like a tribal war god.
A Christian book has got to be understood in the way Christians understand it.
So just to ask a direct yes or no question, and appreciate a direct yes or no to this. The God that you believe in is the moral author of the universe. Morally justifiably commanded the slaughter of innocent children and women. Yes or no?
Check, check. 1, 2. We're just getting the YouTube live stream going, but thank you all for being here, nice and early. We're going to get going on YouTube, and yeah, we're about 15 minutes away from starting, so rock and roll. Feel free to just relax.
Hello, everyone.
This is Don Prager. He's up here doing a little pre-show chat with me today.
Yep. Travis and I, we've been talking for a while now, haven't we? We met on Discord, what?
Well, you came in the StreamYard days. So Don was originally just someone who signed up to come on and have engage in a digital Pangburn discussion, and then eventually moved his way up the ranks, and now he's
pretty much, yeah. And
one of your co-host to our weekly show, the Pangburn Update. And what else do? You also help judge our Discord server, which is a huge job.
Yeah, on the Discord and on the update, we do the co-host show on the update, and we kind of talk about these topics. We go over it week by week, what's going on in the intellectual sphere, what people are talking about, and stuff like that. It's been fantastic.
If you guys want to join us, if you're ever looking for a place that you can go to online that you're going to get a good faith, helpful engagement with your ideas, and you like talking about different topics, like the topic tonight, is the Bible true? You can come into the Pangburn Discord server and find a conversation at any time throughout your day. If you work a night shift, or if you work somewhere where you're allowed to have a conversation happening in your ear and you're able to talk, a lot of people do that on our Discord server, and it's for bricklayers or PhDs. We have a variety of different levels of education and skills and techniques. One is not better than the other in the Pangburn world. It's just everyone tries to engage in good faith and helpfulness. Those are the two kind of physical properties that hold the Pangburn universe together, and that's what we look for our speakers to bring to the table when they come and speak, and we'll be looking for that from Alex and Dinesh tonight.
Yeah, the main point is to find a small refuge away from all the toxicity that you end up finding around these topics, and the name calling and the unhelpfulness. And I think that's like what we try to do on the online space, and as well, I know this is Travis's mission within these conversations that hopefully Alex and Dinesh will have tonight. Yeah,
well, I tell you, they were just hanging out doing a mic check here, and they are both pumped up and ready to go tonight. This truly is an intellectual rumble in the Bronx, and I think that this is going to be the biggest intellectual challenge for each of them tonight. And I know that's saying a lot because Alex is 25, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Alex, haven't been following what he's been doing, he's been going head-to-head with some seasoned veterans in this space, and he's been doing it extremely well, based on my opinion. And Dinesh, I mean, a lot of people would say that, like, when Dinesh went head-to-head with Christopher Hitchens, Dinesh came out on top because Hitchens did not address the presuppositional argument Hitchens didn't address the presuppositional argument that Dinesh was presenting. And I'm sure Alex will, because he's an academic philosopher. This is his domain. So this will be interesting. What are you expecting, Don?
I mean, I think that if anyone's kept up with Alex's work, he recently was on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and what they talked about a lot was truth. And the question is the Bible true? Can go in many different directions. Like, which way is someone going to defend the truth? Are they going to go for like a archaeological, scientific truth, which we've seen many years, or are they going to take a much more metaphorical approach to truth? And there's a question: is the discussion going to are they going to be able to meet minds there, or not just talk past each other? And that's a different
dimensions, and most importantly, different genres. So the first question I suppose I'd like to ask you is: do you agree, for example, that at least some biblical texts are attempts at historical biography, such as in the Gospels?
Of course, I would agree with that. But let me just qualify it this way.
Sure.
when we think of the Bible as revealed, the question now becomes, what do we mean? Did God write the book? Did God inspire the book and human beings wrote it? Did God show human beings events that they then described in their own words? Okay, so the reason these things are important is, it seems to me, to answer the question I raised earlier about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the way I understand it is there's a perfect revelation shown to a gospel, to a Bible, to a Jewish scribe who sees it, so to speak, but writes it in his own words. When I look at the book of Revelation, same thing.
And does it get anything wrong? Do those scribes get anything wrong?
It's quite possible that they, when you say get anything wrong, they are writing it in human terms. I mean, you know...
I mean the specifically mundane human things. I'm not talking about when the author of Genesis says that God created the heavens and the earth, or talks about the Spirit moving across the face of the water. This is clearly mythological. This is clearly an attempt at mythological writing. That's fine. It would be silly to ask if that's true or not. But when somebody...
I don't think it is mythological writing at all. I think that it is simply... I mean, put it this way. If we were, in the year 4000 BC, if we were John the Divine, and let's just say that God showed us in a vision the actual end of the world, right? Sure. Apocalypse. We would then write down the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death and famine and destruction. We're not engaging in myth-making at all. I'm actually writing what I see.
So you think there'll be a 7-headed demon?
Of course not. I'm saying that to me, what I'm seeing is so, let's just say, for example, it is a thermonuclear explosion. Sure. of a kind that the ancient Bible writer doesn't even know what it is.
Yeah.
Right? And the consequence of it is death and destruction and famine. He's going to write it down the way he sees it.
But
right?
where's he going to get the 7-headed dragon and the prostitute from?
This is
like a human attempt to describe a nuclear reaction?
Yes, because when words and images fail, metaphor is the actual conduit to truth.
Now, I'd understand if that were the case, if you said that perhaps after a nuclear blast, somebody describes it as, the gods of fire descending upon man with their flaming swords or something like that. But like a prostitute and a 7-headed dragon?
Well, first of all, I'm not saying it is a nuclear explosion. The problem is we're given this admittedly phantasmagorical future account, right?
Sure.
It is so wrenching and powerful that many people, for example, have tried to render it by art.
Yep.
And it's not easy to do it, right? Mm-hmm. It's not easy to do it because we have to stop and realize, first of all, that we're dealing not only with the limitations of perception, but the limitations of language. Let me give you a simple example. I come to America from India. I have never eaten a mushroom. Okay? I ask you, Alex, what does a mushroom taste like?
Sure.
I would submit that you would be completely unable to render to me in words, however lengthy and ornate, what a mushroom actually tastes like.
That may be true, but I was asking, for example, about Jesus' presentation at the Temple of Jerusalem after his birth. This is not like trying to describe a mushroom or the end of the world.
No. So now let's talk about that.
Hold on a second. This is a historical event that's being recorded by one New Testament writer at the same time as another New Testament writer says that the family had traveled to Egypt. I don't think this is an attempt at metaphor or allegory, as I would say of Genesis. Whether you think that is or not, I would say that in the case of the Gospels, we can agree that on at least some instances, this is a clear attempt at mundane history. This is not an attempt at writing some kind of metaphor to explain a truth that's otherwise unknowable to the human mind. It's a very straightforward attempt to record what actually happened, and they contradict each other.
They contradict each other because they're written by 4 different people.
Sure. So one of them is wrong.
Let me ask you this. If God were writing it, I'm quite sure he would have written it once. You would need 4.
Sure.
Okay?
So some of them are wrong then?
No. Okay, so when you say they're wrong, let's consider Luke's gospel for a minute.
Yep.
Luke is a medical doctor. Luke is not present at the events being described. Luke is virtually in the position of Thucydides writing the Peloponnesian War. Now, Thucydides did fight in the war, but in most of the events described by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, he wasn't there.
Making them very unreliable, right?
No, on the contrary. It is, in fact, the most reliable account of the Peloponnesian War that historians have.
Let's not say that it is reliable, though.
No, it is. What I'm trying to say is that when you're talking about historicity, and you're talking about historicity now in the ancient world, you have to recognize that these people are not approaching it as modern historians. Luke is going around interviewing people.
So let me ask this very, very straightforwardly then.
Okay.
Luke says that after the birth of Jesus, the family fled to Egypt. Matthew says that they went to the Jerusalem temple. Are they both correct, or is one of them wrong?
Who the heck cares? I mean, look.
Well, I do, and so
well,
do
you
probably
do,
the
but,
people
but,
who
but,
are listening to a debate about whether the Bible is true.
Let me say why what you care about is not only trivial, but indicates a kind of unwillingness to try to get what the text is trying to communicate.
I'll tell you why I don't think it's trivial.
Why
because
is it
I think
not
that the
trivial?
reason why Luke may have invented the flight to Egypt, well, he tells us. Luke says, when he records the flight to Egypt, and then they return from Egypt, he says, this is so that we can fulfill the prophecy from Hosea chapter 11, out of Egypt I shall call my son. Now, in Hosea, God is talking here about the nation of Israel. At least in this case, unlike the Matthew prophecy, the prophecy actually exists and we can interrogate it. It seems to me like what Luke is doing here is attempting to display Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. And in fact, he tells us that that's what he's doing. Therefore, if it is the case that Jesus didn't go to Egypt and didn't come out of Egypt on his return, then this would undermine Luke's attempts to identify Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy. That's why I think it is relevant.
Well, look.
And not trivial.
Right, but I think that
Would you agree with that? I mean, do you think it's a completely trivial point? If it's so trivial,
no, I think that the point,
then why
as
is it included in the first place?
point as you stated it before, is trivial. The point you're now raising is not trivial, but the point you're now raising is one in which you have 3 centuries of Jewish-Christian disputation about whether Jesus is the Messiah. Okay, and by and large, the disputation breaks down in this way: the Jews are the biblical literalists, and the Christians are the sort of metaphorical readers. And I say this because let's take a very famous passage that bears on this very topic, where Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. And the Jews go, you said the temple would be destroyed. Now, interestingly, Jesus did say the temple would be destroyed, and the temple was in fact destroyed in 70 AD. In fact, 40 years years after Jesus said that, the temple was in fact physically razed to the ground, and the Jews dispersed in a huge diaspora. But my point is, Jesus doesn't reply that. Jesus doesn't say, hey, listen, wait 40 years. Jesus says, no, you're misreading me completely. When I said the temple, I was actually speaking of the temple of my body.
No, he doesn't tell them that.
But this is stated.
But we're told that that's what he means.
We're told that's what he means.
Say that.
So what I'm getting at is, here you have a case where you have an event, you have a Jewish literalist reading and a Christian metaphorical reading.
Yep.
Another example, and you know.
So would you say then the flight to Egypt is a metaphor? Is that what you're trying to say? In other words, I'm trying to understand what it is that you're doing here to actually answer the question that I'm asking you, which is about, because here's my theory, here's an idea.
Okay.
Luke, the author of Luke, invents the flight to Egypt in order to identify Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, meaning that when we read Luke, we should note that where it appears that he's making historical claims, we should note his willingness to twist history in order to fulfill a theological
Well, you don't know
aim.
if he's doing that. You're assuming that. This is your theory.
No. What I'm saying is that that's one thesis to explain the contradiction between Luke and Matthew. If you want to say that it's trivial, then fine, but we still have to explain how it comes about. And what I'm saying is one idea of how this comes about leads to us undermining our trustworthiness of Luke. What I'm asking you for is your explanation that would not lead to us having to undermine the trustworthiness of Luke.
I don't have the ability to referee that passage. I'm not aware of this contradiction. I'll have to go back and look and see.
That's fine.
Go and look it up. But what I am doing is I'm questioning your methodology and your kind of what would I call it? You got the Jews and the Christians arguing about events, and they're very complex events, and they're very powerfully meaningful events. Like let's take for example, Abraham and Isaac are going up the mountain. Mm-hmm. And Isaac says to Abraham something to the effect of, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham says to him, God will provide. God will provide. Now, in a Jewish reading, this whole thing has got to be understood in terms of, here's Abraham, he's willing to sacrifice his son, God says stop, it's a tale of obedience. In the Christian reading, it's not that, or it's not only that. The Christian reading is, Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So when Isaac says, where's the lamb? And Abraham says, God will provide, it is a foreshadowing of a significant event in the New Testament. Now again, as I say, the Jews and the Christians argued this for 3 centuries and more. I'm not even trying to adjudicate who's right, but I'm saying you're waltzing in, coming with neither of these two assumptions. In fact, I assume you think that the Old Testament is as mythological as the New.
No.
Okay.
Sorry, I need to.
And I guess what I'm saying is that people who read the Bible to understand what the Bible is trying to say and what we can learn from it, do what the Jewish rabbis did and do what theologians like Augustine and Anselm and so many others have done. They don't really do what you're doing, which is saying, hey, Luke must have talked to a guy who thought it happened over here, but in fact, you know, this guy says the roof was thatched, but another guy says they let the guy in through the roof who had to be healed. Contradiction. Yep. And I'm like, is this your way of trying to say the Bible is not true?
Yes, it is. The Old
is?
Yes.
Okay.
That's precisely what I'm doing. The Old Testament is not fully mythological. I think Genesis is mythological. I think that Exodus makes more of an attempt at history, but has mythological undertones. I think that the military conquests I mentioned in my opening statements are attempts at describing literal historical events. I think that the Psalms are poetry. I think that Job is mythology. I don't think a man called Job actually existed, right? And so there are lots of different genres here. The reason I'm asking about the contradictions in the gospel, and I understand if you don't want to talk about the specific example of Egypt and Jerusalem, fine, whatever, maybe you can send me an email about it later or something, that's fine. But the reason I bring it up is to say that there are lots of these. And in each case, if we try to look at why they might be contradicting each other, the reasons I think we're given tell us that the historicity of this text should be in dispute. For example, I mentioned the date of Jesus' death. The Synoptic Gospels specifically place this after the Passover meal. They have the Last Supper as the Passover meal.
Okay.
John uniquely sets it before the Passover because he has the theological purpose of wanting to depict Jesus as the Passover lamb.
Mm-hmm.
Now, This is a contradiction if the Gospels are supposed to be historical accounts of what happened to Jesus, which I imagine if we were having a debate about whether Christianity were true, about whether the God of the Bible existed, you might put forward, say, an argument for the resurrection of Jesus. You might say, well, we have good historical evidence to think that Jesus arose from the dead, and you might point to the story of the crucifixion and the disciples seeing him after he died. This is a common thread. The problem is that if we're treating it as historical in an area like that, then we have to engage with it as a historical text. Why would they contradict each other? I would say for the same reason that Luke contradicts Matthew in the birth narratives, because they're attempting to make a theological point, which tells us at least, and maybe you think that the New Testament is an entirely theological and in no way a historical text. Would you agree at least that the New Testament writers are seemingly willing to adapt the historicity of an event in order to serve a theological point? Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I would agree that...
Well, that definitely is a contradiction.
Well, it's not a contradiction because, Thucydides is relaying historical events to make a moral point about the nature of politics, and both are completely consistent with each other.
Sure.
It's not as if Thucydides is... So he's a student of power politics. He is making a point. His speeches are driven at making a point, but the point is excavated out of the actual events. Now, I think that there's a reason that we're given 4 perspectival accounts of Jesus' life. And they're not identical. In fact, as I say, if they were identical, you wouldn't need 4. The point of reading these, and I think the way to read them. Let me say a word. If you want to determine veracity, you have to operate a little bit like a jury, and by that I mean. Pick up the Gospel of Mark, the first of the Gospels. Now, by the way, these Gospels are written very proximate to the events they describe. And I say this by the standards of, we're talking about historicity of any historical document.
70 AD, would you say, for Mark?
Yes, I would say within decades of the events that they describe.
But
yes.
crucially, would you agree with most historians that this happened, for example, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, thereby allowing the author of Mark to put the prediction in the words of Jesus' mouth without being anything miraculous?
This is a highly debated point because Mark's gospel leaves off incomplete and has what seems to be at the very end an added section. I don't want to debate that little fragment of Mark. Here's what I'm getting at. If you've never read the Bible, and we've all read the Bible in a way, I was raised Catholic, and so I was habituated to going to Sunday Mass and sort of felt like I didn't know the Bible. I've heard these stories read and so on. But it was a completely different experience for me as an adult to go back with critical skepticism and just read the book of Mark straight through. It has the complete ring of authenticity. And I say this because not only does it give you little details that don't really seem to even belong there. It's clearly not written with a polemical purpose exclusively. Mark will tell you things that not only seem irrelevant, but at other times undermine what he's trying to say. And that is the true ring of authenticity. Because if someone were to... What's that?
An example?
Well, here's an example. In the Jewish tradition, the testimony of a woman was considered inherently suspect, but the testimony of men generally reliable. And therefore, not that the testimony of women was disregarded altogether, but you needed, for example, many women to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, the Gospels tell us that when Jesus was crucified and put in the tomb, if I were Mark or I were Luke and I were trying to be inventive and I were trying to establish a truth for posterity, I would not have it that a group of, let's just say, hysterical women, Mary Magdalene, whoever it was, a group of women go to the tomb and they're the ones who find the tomb empty. This is like a little dubious because most people are going to go, well, yeah, we know, but women, So here's an example of the Gospels insisting upon a point that would only make sense if that was actually the way it happened.
Allow me to answer that, if I may.
Go ahead.
If I may. This is a commonly presented argument for the the historicity of the resurrection, which, by the way, now we're talking as...
Well, I'm not... No, hold on. I didn't say it's an argument for the historicity of the resurrection. I said it was an argument...
Let me say a word.
Okay.
Now we're talking about these texts as if they are historical texts. And the thing about the women is, look, this is quite straightforward to me. Who anoints bodies? Who goes to tombs and anoints bodies after someone dies? It's not men, it's women. And so if the authors of the Gospels had the men go to the tomb to anoint the body, which is what Mary and the other women were doing when they went to the tomb, that itself would be very strange and give us reason to doubt the historicity of the events. In other words, it's like if there's a task that women do, and that task is how Jesus' empty tomb is discovered, then why would he invent it? Why would they invent a story that has men going and doing it? Secondly, you said that you need multiple women's testimony. How many women go to the tomb? Multiple. Thirdly, what do the women do immediately after seeing the empty tomb? They run and tell the men who come and verify it for us. Right. So I don't think that this is this fulfills the criterion of embarrassment at all. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think that if this was an invented story, I'm not saying it is, by the way, but if it were, then of course we could expect the people who discover the empty tomb to be women, because it's women who go to anoint the body at the tomb.
Okay, so let's put together what I just said and you just said, and let's ask the question, based upon what you said and what I said, did it happen that way? And I would submit that what you have done, see, you're doing special pleadings. You could argue I'm doing special pleadings, but I would admit that the thrust of the Bible and the thrust of the story is in fact aimed at delivering a truth from Revelation.
That's fine.
What you're trying to do is saying, all right, I can't contest that because that's outside the domain of reason, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to adopt sort of the nitpicking strategy, and because we got 4 accounts, I'm going to...
Hold on, you're the one who brought that up. You're the one who said that
I did.
Women discovering
and
the
I'm
tomb...
saying nothing you've said has even slightly refuted it.
You don't think anything I just said refuted the idea that would be something you wouldn't expect from the Gospel authors if it were invented?
No, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that let's look at what we agree on, what we disagree on. You agree that in that culture, the testimony of women in general counts for less.
I think this is something that Josephus tells us, but it's impossible to know what sort of culturally people actually thought at the time. It's impossible for us to know. But I'm happy to grant it, yeah, sure.
It's impossible for us to know, even though Josephus says it, okay...
Well, that's in a court of law, right?
No, but what I'm saying is, if you're applying the is it impossible for us to know, I would suggest to you it is impossible for us to know that it was the absolute and unwavering duty of women to provide all the ointments. You've stated that as a fact.
No.
I would say it's impossible for us to know.
What I'm saying is that if somebody's reading this text and you say, well, if this were invented, why would it be women who discover the tomb? That would be embarrassing for them, the so-called embarrassment criterion. I'm saying, would it not be just, is not the fact that we're told why they're going to the tomb to anoint the body, is this not just reason enough?
No.
I mean, look, I'm not the one claiming I know how this went down, by the way. And also, you just accused me a second ago of special pleading. I wanted to ask you what it was that I'm specially pleading.
Well, what I'm saying is that you have an event. These events are described with great precision and a sort of eyewitness presence there. Now, we know in some cases there weren't eyewitnesses, but they're nevertheless described, this is the way it happened. And 4 guys are telling you their point of view, right?
Yeah, none of them the women who actually discovered the tomb, by the way.
No, you're not hearing from the women, I agree. You're 4 male gospel writers, apparently. I lost my train of thought for a second, sorry.
I also don't want to get too caught up on this specific example, but I suppose we'll have to sort of leave it with the audience in the live stream. The point that I'm trying to make is that the historicity of at least some of this is important for Christianity. The historicity of the life of Jesus. Like if it were discovered historically speaking that a man called Jesus never existed, that would completely undermine Christianity.
Are you saying that?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Of course I'm not saying
Let me ask you a different question.
I'm saying that historically it matters. The crucifixion, the resurrection, these are matters which historically matter to Christians. And so when we're dealing with a historical account of what happened, when they're riddled with contradictions, I think that that's a problem. If you don't think that's a problem, then that's fine. But I think that the people listening and wanting to find out if the Bible is true might see that as reason to undermine the trust of the text.
No, first of all, almost everything that we know about those events in terms of modern historical reliability, for example, where is the site of Jesus' crucifixion? Yeah. Unknown.
Allegedly
disputed. There are a couple
sepulchre.
of potential sites, but it's not known. What day of the year was Jesus born? Unknown. we think Jesus lived for 33 years, but let's say that one of the Gospels said it was 33 and the other one said it was 34. Do you think that would actually refute Christianity?
No. No,
okay.
no,
it would not.
No,
It would
no,
actually be
hold
quite
on.
understandable that you'd have two guys,
No, yeah, no,
and
no,
they would
hold
get
on.
that, and they'd be off on that, and this contradiction would be trivial, because the issue is not whether Jesus lived for 33 or 34 years old.
Right,
the issue is something.
that's a different kind, because if you could tell me that the reason why they had specifically chosen those ages was to serve a theological point, knowing that they're willing to sort of adapt history in order to make a theological point, I wouldn't say that that point alone undermines Christianity. What I would say is that it undermines our trustworthiness in the Bible. I'm not saying that any one of these contradictions can tell us Christianity is false. Of course
No,
not.
but I'm saying
But
that-
firstly, the question is not if Christianity is true, it's whether the Bible is true. It may be the case that a man called Jesus came down to earth, rose from the dead. It's just that the gospel accounts get the details wrong, which mean that the Bible is not correct, but the
No,
story
it
that the
doesn't mean
Bible
that.
tells is true. It
Look,
means that Christianity is true, but the Bible is false. That's perfectly consistent.
I'm simply,
so no, I'm not saying
simply
that.
saying that what you're doing is you are supplying a motive that is completely made up, and that I could engage in exactly. Let's just take, for example, the 33 versus the 34 years. Now, here's what I'm saying. If there was such a contradiction, and I were being you, I would say, oh, the reason that Matthew said it was 33 is because 3 is the number of the Trinity. And so 33 has a certain theological resonance because 3 and 3
Dinesh,
is 33.
Dinesh.
Hold on. And then I would come around and say, well, the reason the other guy said 34 is actually 3 plus 4 is 7. God made the world in 7 days. 7 is known to be a number fraught with theological significance. And I'm saying this is basically Alex BS.
Dinesh, the gospel writers tell us that's why it happened. They say that the reason the family went to Egypt was to fulfill the prophecy of Hosea.
Okay, and
They-
so you,
So in other words, if the gospel writer, and now imagine that the gospel writers had written what you just said. Imagine in the actual texts, one of them said he was 33 when he died because of the number 3 and its significance.
Correct.
And another said that he was 34 because of the number 4 and its significance. That would be a contradiction. And in that instance, not just a historical contradiction, but a spiritual and theological one too.
actually, no, it actually wouldn't.
Oh, come on.
It wouldn't. I'll
How
tell
would
you
that-
why.
You don't think that's a contradiction?
No, it's not a contradiction at all, because the gospel writers are constantly
Contradicting each other?
not contradicting each other. If they were constantly contradicting each other, you wouldn't have spent half an hour on a single event that, frankly, I haven't even heard of. In fact, no one's ever heard of. I've never ever heard
which
anyone
event?
discuss this in any context. So
Wait,
you
wait,
fish
wait,
out
wait,
this,
which event?
this prophecy about Hosea. I'll go back and look at all this. But what I'm trying to get at is, if you had a plethora of contradictions, you wouldn't be spending the
Hold on.
entire debate on one that I'm sure no one in the audience has heard of either.
Hold on.
But okay, you've heard of it.
you
Probably
don't-
because you've been listening to his YouTube channel, right?
You don't think that this is a highly discussed point of contention in the Gospels, the flight to Egypt and its contradiction with
The flight to
Jerusalem
Egypt,
temple.
look, the flight to Egypt is an important event in the
Okay,
gospel. I'm not saying,
Dinesh, also, you said, why could you only bring up this one example? Take your pick. The date of Jesus' crucifixion, whether they're to take a staff or not to take a staff, the dating of Jesus flipping the tables at the temple, Mary Magdalene and what she says at the tomb, when the temple curtain rips. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that this happens before Jesus' death, and in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, it says that it happens afterwards. We can go through any of these contradictions that you like, but the problem is that what you're going to tell me is that it's trivial, and then when I try to explain that it's not trivial, you say, oh, well, I haven't even heard of it, and no one else really cares about this. When other people do, by the way, this is a highly discussed point of contention in the Gospel. All I'm asking you to do is say that this is... You know when I mentioned the staff in my opening statement, and I said that whether or not they take a staff is a totally trivial contradiction. I'm not bothered by that. If I were a Christian, I would say, yeah, of course, because the texts are not going to perfectly accord. But for some reason, Augustine could not accept this, and so comes up with this ludicrous idea of a literal staff and a metaphorical staff that Jesus is talking about. If you were willing to just say, yes, this is a contradiction, but that doesn't upset the method of Christianity, I think it would be a much more defensible and respectable approach. But instead it seems that you're unwilling to admit that there's even a single contradiction in these texts.
I am saying that the texts are written from 4 different points of view.
Do they contradict each other?
And it is quite possible that on details, Matthew tells you things that are not in Mark or different than Mark. Contradict Mark.
Contradict Mark.
Yes, contradict Mark. And so the point is, here's my point. You're acting, look, put it this way. You would be scoring a point if you could say, God wrote 4 books and they contradict each other. Just like if you're able to say, Dinesh said this in the beginning of the debate and that at the end of the debate. Dinesh is contradicting himself. On the other hand, if we have two guys who are here today to go and write an account of this debate, right? And then we look at their accounts, which are authentic, first person. I was their accounts with a lot of detail.
Yep.
And one guy says, for example, you know, the lights were dark. The other guy says the lights were dim. Or one guy says, for example, that Dinesh was sitting at a 45-degree angle. Another guy says it was a 50-degree angle.
Yeah. But
These are
now,
not.
now imagine,
and then
now
someone goes, Dinesh was sitting at a 43.5-degree angle because he thought this was a way of maximizing his rhetorical effectiveness for the audience. People would be like...
Now imagine somebody said, Alex was wearing a blue jacket, and the reason he was wearing a blue jacket, someone said it's a blue jacket, someone else said it's a red jacket. Who cares? You're quite right. But if somebody said specifically, I know that the reason he was wearing a blue jacket was because there's an upcoming election in the UK that's just been announced, and he was trying to represent the Conservative Party. And somebody else said, I know that the reason he was wearing red, and in fact he told us himself that the reason he was wearing red is because he wanted to support Labour in the upcoming general election in his home country.
Okay, perfect
You would
example.
say, that is a contradiction and means that one of you wasn't paying close enough attention, not just to the colour of my jacket, but the very message that I was trying to get across.
That could well be true, but what I'm getting at is we know, just from normal experience, that if the two of us are sitting in a cafe and we see an accident, these kinds of differences are normal. So let's just say, for example, here's God showing us a revelation, and the revelation can be whatever it is, and you and I write an account of it, and somebody finds that my account of it not only is different than yours, but let's just say, for example, I go, oh, Jesus was wearing a cloak. Another guy goes, he's wearing a robe. For anyone to actually think that this is, in fact, a refutation of the truth of the Bible is ludicrous. So anyway, in our format, we've agreed to do a flip where you've been asking me questions now. Let me ask you something.
If you've got something to ask.
Let me turn around and ask you questions in a sort of what I think is a more fundamental mode, because it gets to what the Bible really is.
Let's hear it.
Do you think that the universe had a beginning?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I would suspect yes.
You suspect yes?
Yeah, sure.
How did the writers of the book of Genesis know that?
I have no idea. If I'm going to
They guessed?
If I'm going to be cynical about this, if they did guess, it would be a 50-50 guess. And I also think that if we had scientific...
Would it be a 50-50 guess?
Yeah, and it might even be worse than that for you, because if we had some kind of scientific popular hypothesis, because of course the Big Bang might not have been the beginning of everything, who knows, right? But like whatever the popular scientific hypothesis is, if it were pointing to an infinite universe, for example, as Einstein thought we lived in, then I'm sure that people would open Genesis. They would say that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and say that the earth just means the earth itself, right? Like I think it would be equally easily interpretable on either account.
All right. So one of my professors at Dartmouth was Robert Jastrow. He headed the Mount Wilson Laboratory, one of the great astronomers of the 20th century.
Sure.
So Jastrow writes in his book, God and the Astronomers, that for 250 years, modern science has been attempting to discover whether the universe had a beginning. And you can think of these scientists as ascending a very tall mountain in which there are many pathways. And for many years, with the steady state hypothesis and so on, there were beliefs that the universe was eternal. It never had a beginning. In fact, that was the prevailing point of view. And then Jastrow argues it's almost as if we reached the top of the mountain and there was a bunch of Hebrew prophets or theologians sitting there who had been there from the beginning. So I'm describing now a skeptic, a true skeptic, and a true scientist describing the scientific shock that attends to a discovery that, and I think it is out of the spirit of that discovery for you to go, oh yeah, I mean, it could have been this. It's like tossing a coin. It isn't like tossing a coin. This is a question that's been argued for 2 centuries and only resolved in the last several decades, and resolved decisively in one side and the other. And the fact that you're not willing to just straight out say, yeah, it is actually an astounding fact that we now know.
No. I mean, look, the scientific method has also revealed to us that the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago. That is much later than the sun. The Old Testament account, the Hebrew Bible account, tells us that it was the other way around. So it got that bit wrong.
All right. So we're yes. The Bible is not.
So
is
sometimes it
the
gets
Bi-
things right,
No, no,
sometimes
no.
it gets things wrong, you know?
The Bible is not
It's
a
not that
science.
astounding to me.
It's not listing out a scientific.
Well, now hold on a second. You can't now move the goalpost, especially if you're still gonna miss.
The
after doing
issue.
so.
Well, the issue of the origin of the universe is extremely critical.
You just told me that Genesis predicted, or knew about, or somehow knew about the scientific hypothesis of the origin of the universe. Then, when I pointed out another scientific observation that doesn't accord with Genesis, you tell me that Genesis isn't a scientific text to begin with.
Well, if you read Genesis, it is making a astounding claim, which pertains to God. Obviously, God created the
Is
heavens
it making
and
a
the earth.
scientific claim or not? Is it telling us how the universe scientifically formed or not?
It's not telling us how the universe scientifically formed, because if it did, they would be outlining the history of the Big
Then what's
Bang.
the relevance of bringing this up in the first place?
Because it is stating a conclusion, not a process. It's not telling you how the universe was formed.
Right.
It's
It
not
also
telling
doesn't
you
tell us-
about.
It also doesn't tell us how the sun was formed, but it tells us that it was formed after the earth was. It tells us that that's the case. That's wrong. It's incorrect.
Show me.
Oh, I don't have a Bible.
Okay.
But-
Well, I've read that passage maybe a dozen times. I have never spotted this contradiction that you're describing. But I'll go back and look at it again. But again,
on what day is it that God makes the sun? And day 4? Is day 3 or day 4, something around there?
you're right. But
When's
but
light
the
created?
mainstream of the Christian tradition does.
When's the
It
heaven and
obviously
the earth
can't
created?
be day 4 because the concept of day in the original Hebrew doesn't mean day.
Sure, but day 4 comes after day 1, right?
Well,
How long the day
it's
is.
describing obviously epochs or periods.
Yeah,
yes.
so actually it's much worse because how the sun is created much later than the earth was.
Well, not necessarily. Well, show me.
I don't know. I mean, we can read through that. We can find Genesis.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if that would be the best use of our time. I mean, we could do it if you really want to. But what I'm trying to say is that like, it's not astonishing.
Let's move on.
It's
Let's
not-
move on.
Why not? It's not astonishing to me that like if you're making claims about the origin of the universe, especially in the case where if it is making a specific claim in the knowledge that there's a sort of infinite hypothesis and a beginning hypothesis, to take a 50-50 stab, it's not amazing to me. It would be more amazing to me if everything lined up and it gave us an otherwise unknowable historical scientific account of the beginning of the universe. But as you say, that's not even what Genesis is trying to do. So I don't. In other words, I don't understand how this even
I'm not
pertains to
saying that
motion.
Genesis is trying to unfurl a. I'm saying that Genesis is making a statement about creation, and the statement about creation has a very startling scientific implication. Because if there was a creation, then there obviously wasn't something, and then there was something.
But I mean, it's not just science which can tell us that the universe had a beginning. I mean, like there are lots of philosophical arguments that people have made. Perhaps most famously, Al-Ghazali, who argues against for the impossibility of a past infinite universe, and I think does so quite convincingly, with no reference to redshifting and no reference to scientific hypotheses. So it's perfectly possible for somebody to take a pretty studious and educated guess at the fact that the universe had a beginning long before the scientific method told us that that was the case.
I'm not saying that it's not possible to make philosophical arguments, and of course, as you know, there was a tradition in ancient Greece of making philosophical arguments all over the place.
So maybe that's why the
let me keep going. It's my time. Let me pose questions.
I'm trying to answer your question. Maybe if you ask me how would they know, isn't this astounding? I would say, well, maybe they just had a philosophical tradition that taught the beginning of the universe, and that's where they got it from.
Except that
Not inconceivable.
it's not inconceivable, but it's not likely, because when we think of the tradition of Western civilization, we speak of Athens and Jerusalem. We speak of the origins of philosophy starting in about the 8th century BCE, and then really developing first in Greece. And then we talk about the tradition of revelation developing in ancient Jerusalem.
Yep.
So was there a hidden philosophical tradition? Possible, but probably unlikely. Let's proceed to the let's proceed to the issue of the veracity of some of the historical events described in the Bible. Would you say that figures like Jeremiah, David, are these historical figures or mythological figures?
I'd say I don't know for certain, but I would say that the Bible is certainly attempting to paint them as historical figures.
Forget what it's attempting to do. You've been trying to.
So I don't know. But
you don't know.
I'm
you have no
happy
idea.
to say yes.
Okay, so on a.
I mean, I would predict yes. I would say yes.
You would say yes.
That's what I would imagine. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think that Sodom and Gomorrah are historical cities?
Probably yeah.
Probably yes. Would you say that Pontius Pilate was a real person?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Would you say that, all right, now, these statements that you're saying now were in no way known to be true until recent decades. And
Some of those, I'm not sure.
all the ones I
If
mentioned.
you're talking about like archaeology,
Yeah, I'm talking biblical archaeology. Let me give you an example of what we're
Archaeology
talking
can't
about.
prove the historical existence of a person very easily.
Well, let me go into this a little bit here.
And also, I want to make sure we're using the time wisely here. You could give me a sound archaeological bit of evidence that all of these people existed that in no way tells us about the truth of the stories that are attributed to them.
No, it does. Well, let me put it this way. For many centuries, this is a whole tradition of biblical scholarship in the 19th century. In fact, really until in some cases 10, 15, or 20 years ago, there was absolutely no evidence historically for the existence, for example, of a Hezekiah, Jeremiah, David, let alone actual locations for David's palace.
Sure.
Hezekiah's
tomb.
All right. Hezekiah's
his tunnels.
Tunnels. Now, let me tell you something I discovered. I was getting a tour recently, a few months ago, in Israel from the guys at Hebrew University, and they were talking about an archaeologist named Elliot Mazar, who's what she calls herself a biblical archaeologist. She's not a Christian or even a believer, but the way that she does archaeology is this. She has the Bible in one hand and the sort of the pickaxe in the other. And the approach to it is pretty simple. It is, I want to find David's palace. Now, no one has ever heard of David's palace is in the Bible, but there's no independent corroboration of it at all. There's a foundation in Jerusalem called the City of David Foundation. They have a little office. Dr. Elliot Mazar walks in their office and says to them, you have to move your office because the palace of David is in the ground underneath your office. And these guys are like, how would you know that? And Dr. Mazar says, because if you read the Bible, it will tell you that David, when he built his palace, brought in Phoenician builders who brought materials from Phoenicia and also brought Phoenician building expertise. The Phoenicians were apparently the builders of the day. And so Dr. Mazar says, we have found Phoenician seals, Phoenician coins, Phoenician inscriptions here. And so I predict that the palace is right underneath here because the Bible tells me that that's how that palace was built. So
David's palace exists.
David's palace is there for you to see today.
Okay.
And it is in the exact location of where it was said to be. And what I'm getting at is the archaeological approach here is to use the Bible as an archaeological tool. The location of Sodom and Gomorrah. there was a lot of speculation that said Sodom and Gomorrah were cities over here or cities over there, but actually makes no sense. Because A, what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah is that they were once flourishing cities. 2, they were burned to ashes. 3, Abraham supposedly could see the smoke from a long ways away. And so these locations of Sodom and Gomorrah were never found until recently. By recently I mean recent decades. An archaeologist, again in the Eliot Mazar tradition, takes the Bible and says, for Sodom and Gomorrah to exist, it's not enough to just go looking and see if we find stuff and go, hey, is this Sodom and Gomorrah? Let's actually follow the tracks of the Bible. Let's follow the map provided admittedly in very sketchy terms. The Bible is not trying to give you a map, but it's giving you clues. And based on these clues, the actual Sodom and Gomorrah is located, and you dig into it, and guess what? You find the remains of an ancient city, and you also find ash and debris. In other words, there was an ancient city there. It was completely burned to the ground. So one of the great cities of the ancient world then becomes an absolute nothing, and has been an absolute nothing since. And not only does the Bible describe these events, but it says exactly that. That these great cities will cease to exist and will never be resurrected again, as they have not been to this day.
If I may, because I'm beginning to suspect this isn't a question, I might just jump in here. Sure, yeah, okay, so the authors of the Hebrew Bible.
My conclusion.
So if I might answer the question. I mean, it is your time, but I need to be able to speak as well. The Bible contains accurate data about where archaeologically we can find the ruins of ancient cities. Okay, that's not too extraordinary to me. I have no problem saying that the people who wrote these texts knew where these places were with exact precision. And in fact, notice what's happening. Notice what's happening, in my view. What's happening is that the Bible is a historical text and a scientific text when it needs to be, and it's not one when you don't want it to be. So when I said a moment ago, here's a relatively mundane historical fact about the Gospels, you said, well, the fact that some mundane historical fact should undermine Christianity is ludicrous. But now you're telling me that a mundane historical fact is enough to buttress Christianity. I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too in that case.
I'm not trying to have my cake and eat it too. I'm simply saying that if somebody gives a true account of events, complete with small details that are incidental to the narrative, the Bible refers to very minor figures at times. Let's take, for example, Caiaphas. Caiaphas is one of the 2 high priests who is present at Jesus' trial. We don't even know his first name. He's mentioned as Caiaphas. The historian Josephus calls him Josephus Caiaphas. And that is the only indication from Josephus, and only one source, and a source writing a little later, of what this guy's name even was. And until recently, a few decades ago, there was absolutely no corroboration that there was ever a guy even named Caiaphas. Except now, not only do we have inscriptions with his name, we actually have his bones.
But Dinesh, what does this matter?
Okay, so what I'm getting at
what does this matter at all to the question?
Why does it matter?
Why does this matter?
Because if somebody is giving a true account of events, a guy comes running into this room and he goes, guess what? I've just witnessed a murder. He's going to give us a lot of accounts and a lot of detail, right? Now,
look, if somebody was trying to claim that Moses parted the Red Sea, and I said, well, how could you possibly know that's the case? And you said, well, look, we didn't have any evidence that a guy called Moses existed, but we've discovered this rock where someone wrote Moses was here.
No.
Great, okay, we know
No.
Moses existed, and maybe we know where he existed. But the actual events, the stories that are attributed to these characters are in no way supported by anything that you're saying. And that's the important thing. I think that's what people are interested in. I doubt that anybody in this room, and they can make themselves known if they're here, I don't think anybody in this room either thinks that it's important or is troubled in their skepticism by the existence of these people and the real existence of the places that are described in the Old Testament.
Right, and neither do I think that a single Christian believer in the world would be shaken by anything that you've said today. So let's really try to meet in the middle on the stuff that really matters. And I think what we're really saying, when you mentioned the parting of the Red Sea, to me, it's like, now we're talking. Because we're talking about...
These are different.
These are categorically different types of events.
I mean what you just said, these are different because people are troubled by what I say and they're not troubled by what you say. Because for an atheist to say that Hezekiah existed doesn't mean they can't be an atheist. For a Christian to say that Jesus didn't historically rise from the dead means that they're not a Christian.
Correct.
So these are different, they're asymmetrical.
They're asymmetrical. So let's pick up the.
So it matters. It matters when the historical elements are wrong, in terms of our grand conclusion. For the Christian, it matters when the history gets it wrong. For the atheist, it doesn't matter when the history gets it right.
What I'm saying is that if someone gives a true account of events, it is normal for the accounts to vary, to differ, in some cases to have minor contradictions.
Sure.
The real question is did the thing that's being described actually happen?
Okay, so
let's turn to that.
Do you think, for example, that the slaughter of the Amalekites that I mentioned before actually happened?
Probably, yeah, of course.
And if that happened, I mean, we haven't spoken about the concept of moral truth. I'd like to get the time to do so.
We can come to that, but let's stay with what I think you were about to get to, which I think is the heart of the matter that we haven't even gotten to, and that's this. The Bible is where the Bible is the most unbelievable is in its account of astounding and miraculous events.
Sure.
Right? Healings. Let's take the most outrageous event of all, which is, let's just say, bringing a guy back from the dead.
Yeah.
Presented in the Bible as a miracle.
We're talking about Lazarus here, rather than
I'm talking
Jesus.
here about Lazarus. Yes, Lazarus. Perfect. Now, for a Christian would say this: the Bible doesn't try to prove it, it simply asserts it. In fact, it presents it as a truth of revelation, if you will. God revealed this. It's a miracle, which is to say that it is not something that happens within the seeming known laws of nature, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the question really here is, are these kinds of miracles possible? If you say, are they implausible, or are they rare, or is it difficult to believe, the Christian is like right with you.
I think the question is, did they happen?
Did they happen, right? And here's where the Christian and the atheist are on common ground, because the Christian and the atheist would both say that based upon ordinary experience, it can't happen.
Sure.
Because otherwise it wouldn't be a miracle.
So what evidence might we have to suggest that these miraculous events as described in the Gospels did happen?
I'm saying that because the miraculous events, the Christian would simply say, if God exists, miracles are obviously possible.
Sure, I agree.
The atheist has a higher burden. And that is, the atheist has to say that whether or not God exists, which is not the topic of our debate here, miracles are impossible. Because if they're possible...
They don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that?
No, of course they don't have to say that.
You don't have to say that. You say it is possible for a man to be raised from the dead.
I can say that that's possible without thereby...
But you're saying, but this particular one didn't happen, but the event is possible.
Without thereby in any way telling us anything about whether it happened as reported to
Is
Lazarus.
it possible is it possible for the Red Sea to be parted?
Sure, why not?
It is.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean,
is it possible for a...
But what does that do for us? Is it possible that Muhammad flew to heaven on a winged horse?
Okay, so here's our problem.
Well, hold on. Yes or no?
Yes, of course it's possible.
Of course it's possible. So that means that, the miraculous events as described in Islam, you've got such a higher burden of proof than the Muslim does if you're having a debate with a Muslim.
But
because you have to say that's impossible.
I am not trying to prove the veracity of this or that miracle. I freely admit that I can't do that.
I'm not trying to prove the veracity of this
but
or
you
that
can't
miracle.
disprove it either.
No, of course I can't disprove it.
Exactly.
But that's not my task here. That's like me saying, I think that, I don't know, to take a Shakespearean example, I think that, spoiler alert,
Well, we don't need a Shakespearean example.
Romeo took the poison.
Let's take an actual...
And if you said, well, hold on, how do you know that actually happened? And I said, well, you can't prove that it didn't.
Well, let's pick an actual example that pertains to Christianity. Let's talk about something I raised earlier.
We've got about 5 minutes before Q&A,
okay.
by the way.
Do you believe that there is life after death?
I don't know.
You don't have no idea.
Yeah, I'm agnostic on that.
So if I say that there's life after death, am I being unreasonable?
I don't think so.
Not at all.
It depends on your reasons.
It depends on my reasons, but what I'm saying is, if I were to tell you that there is no empirical way to prove this one way or the other, my faith, let's say, that there's life after death is just as reasonable as someone who says there isn't.
Sure, it depends on what the reasons that are given are, of course, but sure. That's...
We're talking about the reasons that are actually available. Not the person who's giving a reason may give the best or not the best reason.
It's pedantic, but I'm happy to say yes. I just want to be careful what I say, because people might get the wrong impression of my beliefs. But yeah, sure. I mean, sure. We've got two people. One says life after death. One says not. They're both just as reasonable as each other.
They're both just as reasonable.
Sure. That could be.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Good. I wanted to clarify that point particularly because
What's
what
this
it
got
really
to do with the truth of the Bible?
well, all I am saying is that the claims of miracles, you and I are not going to be in a position to go back and see whether or not Jesus raised a man from the dead,
Well,
right?
it's not all you say. It's not all you're saying.
The
because
Christian is perfectly willing to take that on faith.
you think that did happen, and you're taking it on faith, and that's fine. Like,
Yes.
more power to you. And in fact, I envy your ability to believe things despite what
Well,
seems to
don't
me
you
like
take a lot of things on faith?
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Plenty of things on
Yeah,
faith.
well, yeah, all the time.
So all the
time.
things that you take on faith
Yeah.
are things that you think are not unreasonable, but the things that Christians take on faith are to you unreasonable because they can't be corroborated with historical evidence.
Is that what I said? I don't remember saying that.
So are the Christian beliefs on faith just as reasonable as everything that you believe on
It
faith?
can be depending on the reasons, but the veracity of the gospel accounts and the Old Testament prophecy, I think, is unreasonable to believe in. Not life after death, that's fine, you can believe that. Not like, a man called Jesus rose from the dead, fine. But the idea that the Bible comports with reality either in mythological sense, in an allegorical sense, in a moral sense, or in the sense of historicity.
Let's talk about the moral sense, since you raised it, and
Fine.
we'll just talk about
I
it
want to
briefly.
make sure we've
and
got
go
time for Q&A. But look, I can reread the text if you like. The Amalekites.
Well, let's not talk about the Amalekites, in part because here's the problem. For most Christians, the Old Testament is different than the New and is seen through the light of the New. So
But
I'm
God is the same.
if you want to go to, Dennis Prager, who has written about this from a Jewish perspective, has written about the Deuteronomy, the Book of Kings, the Amalekites.
Sure, we can bring him out
what he
later,
considers
but-
to be the justifiable massacre of the Canaanites. I don't really want to go there because.
Well, I know why you don't want to go there.
Well,
because
the
it's
reason I don't want to go
unjustifiable.
there, the Old Testament is full of horrific massacres.
Yes, and
that is hold on.
Massacres which are ordained. by God.
Massacres which appear to be ordained by Yahweh directly.
Sure.
Agreed. And
Well,
which
why are you saying
are-
Yahweh instead of God? Why are you
Beca-
subtly
because-
trying to distance yourself from the God of the Old Testament?
Well, I'm not trying to distance myself. I'm simply trying to say that any reader.
So why is that the first time you've used the word Yahweh in this conversation?
I'll tell you why. Because there is a movement within the Bible itself that you are completely missing.
Do you not think that I have come
Hold
to
on, hold on,
abolish
hold
the
on.
law
Let me-
or the
let me-
prophets? I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount, referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy and law.
Referring to his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy.
Old
Look,
Testament law. And what I'm referring to here is an Old Testament law, which you're